The apartment smelled like coffee, and that morning, everything felt different. Marcus sat at the kitchen counter, his laptop glowing softly in the early autumn light, pretending not to notice when his roommate appeared from the hallway. 3 years, Marcus had perfected the art of casual indifference, the practiced glance, the brief smile, and then returning to whatever task demanded his full attention. His roommate's name was David Chen. With the effortless confidence of someone who had never doubted where he belonged in the world, straight, successful, and completely unaware that he was the reason Marcus had started taking longer routes home, the reason he memorized schedules, the reason his emotional weather shifted depending on which kitchen he found David in. "You were up late again," David said. Passing by to grab a mug from the cabinet, their shoulders nearly touched, and Marcus felt the brush like electricity. "Deadlines," Marcus replied, which was technically true. Freelance graphic designer, flexible schedule. But he didn't need David knowing he'd stayed up until 2 a.m., waiting for the hum of laughter from David's friends to fade before he could breathe. Back in the apartment, David poured his coffee with that unself-conscious ease, the kind that assumed the world would simply make space for him. He wore the gray shirt he favored on Fridays, the one that made his eyes look darker, warmer. Marcus had noticed that detail about 14 times a week. "Working on anything interesting?" David asked. Always that careful, genuine interest, the kind that made life simultaneously sweeter and harder. It would be easier if David were distant, dismissive. But no, he was infuriatingly kind. Just a logo redesign for a startup. Marcus muttered, turning his laptop screen slightly away, a habit by now. "Nothing revolutionary." "And you?" "Big plans, actually. I'm heading to a networking event at the Botanical Gardens. My company's sponsoring a conservation initiative. Should be good for the portfolio." David leaned against the counter, casual, relaxed in a way Marcus could never manage. "You should come," David said. "+1s are welcome. Could be good to meet people in different fields." There it was again, David's kindness. Generous, effortless, and entirely oblivious. He thought Marcus didn't have enough people in his life. In reality, Marcus's entire social world had quietly reorganized around David's schedule. He went to bars David never visited, drank coffee at cafes David would never discover. He had built an entire alternate reality just to manage the constant, beautiful ache of being near David without actually connecting. "Thanks, but I've got deadlines," Marcus said, hating himself for both the lie and the relief it brought. "You're lost," David replied, genuine warmth in his voice. "There's leftover pad thai in the fridge if you get hungry. Made too much yesterday." David left. Marcus sat in the silence he had deliberately created, trying to focus. The logo stared back at him, a sterile, abstract symbol of growth and innovation. How ironic. He had been trapped in the same emotional place for 36 months, each day identical to the one before. Nothing evolving except his capacity to hurt. He loved David. Slowly, quietly, the kind of love that had crept up until it became the central axis of his life. It began as simple admiration for someone genuine, someone who didn't constantly perform. David was fully present in conversation, remembered things said weeks ago, left considerate notes, paid his share of the bills without prompting. And he was thoroughly, uncomplainingly heterosexual. Marcus had watched him date accomplished women, trying and failing to dislike them fairly. David's last relationship had ended 6 months ago. Since then, he had carried a particular kind of effortless beauty, relaxed, unpressured, content in his own company that Marcus found nearly unbearable. Evening came. Marcus finished the logo, replied to 3 client emails, stubbornly ordered Thai food from a different restaurant, refusing David's generous leftovers. He worked until midnight, then lay in bed listening to the apartment's silence, trying not to think of David at the Botanical Gardens, probably speaking with confidence about conservation, while some brilliant woman decided she wanted to know him better. Around 2 a.m., Marcus heard David come home. The familiar sound of keys on the entryway table, a quiet sigh, the shuffle of movement. Then, unexpectedly, Footsteps paused outside Marcus' door. Marcus went rigid, every nerve alert. Through the crack in his door, he saw David's silhouette. Time seemed to stretch impossibly. David simply stood there, framed in the dim light, perfectly still. Then he reached out. Marcus couldn't see exactly what David did, but he heard the soft creak of the door. Moments later, something light landed at the foot of his bed. The door closed quietly. Footsteps retreated toward David's room. Marcus waited, frozen, until he heard the door click shut and the apartment settle back into stillness. Slowly he reached down and felt the object through the darkness fabric. A light jacket. David's jacket, the navy one from his company's limited edition line reserved for senior team members. Months ago, Marcus had joked about how cool it was. He'd never expected David to remember. And yet here it was. Left for him at 2 a.m. after a long evening, Marcus held the jacket and felt something shift inside him. To David, it was probably just a kind, absent-minded gesture. To Marcus, it was a message in a language he had been afraid to learn. He pressed it to his face, inhaling David's sense-eater, familiar, warm. Devastating. The emotion hit him suddenly, overwhelming. Marcus had practiced emotional compartmentalization for years, but holding that jacket, feeling David's kindness, something inside him cracked. For the first time in a long time, honesty demanded him, and he was terrified of what that honesty might cost. He spent the rest of the night, the jacket neither fully asleep nor awake, existing in that liminal space where impossible things sometimes feel possible. Morning came, and with it, a choice. He could return the jacket casually, preserve the comfortable fiction they had built, or he could finally acknowledge the vulnerability that had been growing like a persistent ache. David's small gesture had done the unexpected. It had shown Marcus that some forms of invisibility are only possible when you refuse to be seen. And maybe after 3 years of strategic absence, it was time to risk something different. Marcus wore the jacket the next day. It was a small, calculated risk, deliberate but subtle. He paired it with carefully chosen pieces he'd normally never attempt: dark jeans and a fitted Henley. Nothing flashy, just slightly more intentional than his usual uniform of blending into the background. He draped the jacket casually over his shoulders, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to wear David's company merchandise. When David emerged from his room that afternoon, Marcus held his breath. Forcing an air of casual indifference, David's eyes registered the jacket before anything else. They widened slightly, then softened into something warmer. Something Marcus's hopeful heart couldn't quite trust her. Perhaps it was only projecting recognition. "Hey," David said, "you're wearing it!" There was something in his tone that made Marcus's stomach twist. "Looks better on you than I thought it would." "Really good quality," Marcus said carefully. True, but pathetically inadequate, as a response to what he was beginning to suspect wasn't just a casual gesture between roommates. "Thanks for the random act of kindness," Marcus added, still uncertain. David paused in the doorway, leaning in that easy, relaxed way of his. "Not random," he said finally. "I mean, I'd been thinking about it for a while. You mentioned liking it months ago, and I just forgot about it until recently. Not a profound confession, perhaps, but something in the slight hesitation and unfamiliar." Note in David's voice suggested he was stepping out of his usual certainty. Marcus felt something cautious, expansive, stir in his chest. "Well, I appreciate it," he said. Then, with a deep breath, "Thanks." David nodded, and in a movement so natural it almost seemed unconscious, he reached out and adjusted the collar of the jacket. His fingers brushed the base of Marcus's neck. The contact was fleeting, barely perceptible, but Marcus felt it everywhere, from his nerves to his chest. "It looks good on you," David repeated. His voice was quieter now, careful in a way Marcus had never heard. Then, stepping back, he said, "I'm heading to the gym." Back in a couple of hours, David left. Marcus sat in the apartment, replaying the moment again and again. He'd become so skilled at seeing only what he wanted in David's actions that he approached this narrative with caution. David was kind to everyone he might have already forgotten giving him the jacket. The collar adjustment could have been practical, but the hesitation, the The subtle uncertainty was new. That was something Marcus had never heard before. The next 3 days settled into a rhythm that felt almost orchestrated. Though Marcus couldn't tell by whom, they spent more time in shared spaces. David began timing his coffee with Marcus's morning work sessions. One evening, he suggested they ordered dinner together instead of separately. They watched a film, sitting on opposite ends of the couch. But David's legs stretched toward Marcus's side. A quiet acknowledgement of proximity neither would name. Their conversations shifted too. David started asking questions that went deeper than casual small talk about Marcus's childhood. Why he chose design, his family, and the ways these things shaped him. Marcus, in turn, found himself sharing fragments of his inner world he'd kept carefully. Compartmentalized for years, 5 days after the jacket appeared, David mentioned an exhibition opening at a contemporary art gallery, the kind of place Marcus had said he wanted to visit but never had the time. I was thinking of going Saturday. Watching Marcus as if gauging his response. Would you want to come? As in, together. Marcus's heart raced like it had on a date. He asked the question and immediately regretted the directness. But David's expression suggested the inquiry was necessary. David took a breath. I'd like it to be, he said slowly, each word deliberate, as though translating from a language he was only just learning. I mean, if that's something you'd want, David said. I'm not entirely sure what's happening between us, but I know I want to understand it. And I think maybe you do too. There was a moment when Marcus's entire inner world seemed to rearrange.